Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, where thousands of people are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening via X-Ray FM stations 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for all the support of our media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on the best civic programs week after week. A special thank you goes out to Oric Public Finance for sponsoring today's program. I'd also like to thank the Civic Scholars from North Clackamas School District for being here today. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. The Portland region is known as home for shoe companies, chip manufacturers, and bookstores. But right next to the Burnside Bridge, you can find the headquarters of a global humanitarian organization. For almost 40 years, Mercy Corps has worked in more than 40 countries to alleviate suffering, poverty, and oppression by helping people gain the skills and resources they need to build a better life. For 25 of those years, Neal Keny-Guyer has served as Mercy Corps' Chief Executive Officer, growing the organization into what Fast Company has ranked as one of the most innovative and social change organizations in the world. Neal holds a BA in Public Policy and Religion from Duke University, a Master's in Public and Private Management from Yale, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on the Humanitarian System. Interviewing Neal today is another world traveler with deep knowledge of health and environmental crises around the world. Jane Greenhalgh is a senior producer and editor on NPR's Science Desk. She was part of the team of journalists who produced the 2015 award-winning series, hashtag 15 Girls, which examined the struggles teenage girls face throughout the developing world. For the 2009 series, Climate Connections, she traveled to Timbuktu, Peru, and Bangladesh to chronicle the impacts of climate change around the world. Please join me in welcoming Neal Keny-Guyer and Jane Greenhalgh to Friday Forum.
Well, first of all, Neal, I want to say what a great pleasure it is to be talking to you today. Your organization is very well known at my organization. NPR covers the globe, and very often Mercy Corps is there in some of the most desperate and dangerous situations imaginable. And that leads me to my first question. When you're faced with such endless need and you have limited resources, does that keep you up at night?
Thanks, Jane. So one, it's great to be here. So the first thing I want to say, it's easier to sleep at night when you're part of a wonderful city that is so civically engaged and that has a wonderful organization like the City Club. And I'm proud to be here and thank the City Club. And I do want to say, if there's anyone out here or listening in and you're not a member, join now. Please. We need all the engaged citizens. So thank you. Secondly, I want to say that it's easier to sleep at night when you're married to the better known Keny-Guyer. And Alyssa, who is here, I am so proud of her work on behalf of our community and state and her leadership, and I'm so grateful for the support that she has shown me. Some of you may know that Alyssa had a recent, fairly serious surgery. I don't think you mind, honey, if I share that. And she's had a remarkable recovery, as anyone can say, but she credits that to just the incredible love and support and purple power of our community. And some of you may not know that when she went into surgery, she got a picture from her colleagues in the legislature all the D's, all the R's together, wearing purple, saying we're with you. And so doesn't that make it easier to sleep, that you know you live in a community of decency and of caring, particularly in a fractured world and often where the politics of our nation are very fractured. So yes, thank you. And then finally, I would just say it is easier to sleep when your global headquarters is in this community, and we have so many amazing supporters here, and I just want to thank everyone. That said, we all know it's a tough world, and I have to confess there are a few issues in the world that occasionally keep me up at night, and I would just say two in particular: the rise of conflict and climate change in our world. And let's start with conflict. And we know they're often connected. But if you start with conflict is around the world right now is at its greatest level for the last 25 years. There are more than 400 conflicts. We all know there's 70 million people displaced by violence. That's the most since we started keeping records. That's one person every 2 seconds. So by the time we finish talking, there will be almost 100 to 200 people that will have been displaced because of violence. So I worry about that. And, you know, we look at climate. Scientists tell us that we really have 10 years to make the kind of changes we need to make, or it could become irreversible. And in my world, from humanitarian standpoint, we all know that by some predictions, by of migration, the IOM, there's predicted to be 200 to 250 million people displaced by climate change by 2050 if we don't make those changes. Other scientists tell us that an increase in malaria, malnutrition, and other maladies will lead to 250,000 more deaths per year. And it seems to me that those two challenges are out-galloping or outpacing our capacity to keep up with them right now. So that does concern me. I also am hopeful. I know we're going to get there and talk about some of the ways to address that. But I do think those are big issues that we face on our planet right now.
I think that those are the two big issues that we are also covering, and sometimes they seem incredibly overwhelming. The conflict issue, you are working in Yemen, Syria, some of the most dangerous places. Some organizations won't even go in there. How do you provide relief when you're worried about your own workers?
Well, it's a great question, Jane. The first thing I would say that as Mercy Corps, we work in 43 countries around the world, but we're probably best known for going to those highly dangerous places. We call them the toughest places in the world. It's where conflict and nasty politics and poor governance collide and extreme poverty collide to keep people trapped. And so we're probably best known for working in the Syrias, the Yemens, the Central African republics, the DRCs, the Afghanistans of the world. There's no magic formula. The first thing that we do is you have to start with very good analytics and understanding of the situation on the ground, the politics, the culture, who are the forces, what are the issues. And so we really do in-depth and detailed analytics. In a number of countries, we provide those analytics to the UN and to our peer groups who use those kind of analysis in order to do the work. We feel that's very important to do. The second thing is we build relationships with all sides. It is important. It's easier said than done. But our ability to provide relief in an impartial manner to everyone who is impacted by a crisis, regardless of their politics, regardless of the things that separate them, is dependent on those local relationships. And then the third thing is, we follow really best practices about moving people in and out, making arrangements. It's one of the reasons that we acquired a group a number of years ago called the Conflict Management Group that was affiliated with Harvard Law School. We brought them under our wing so we could have the best skills in negotiation, in conflict management that the corporate world sometimes takes for granted, that we could bring it into our organization as well. Still, if you know, another thing that probably more than anything that keeps me up at night is worrying about the number of people that we have on the front lines in some of the world's most difficult and dangerous places around the world.
You lost somebody recently, is that correct?
We did, and in fact, it was about 1 week ago at the exact time as we're sitting here. We had an amazing young woman from the UK, was one of our shining stars, 29 years old, had been working for us 2 years in Nigeria, Faye Mooney, and she was murdered, she was killed in an attack in Nigeria about 1 week ago. And it breaks all of our hearts, and the world lost someone. She had been teaching 6 weeks earlier. She had conducted a hackathon on hate speech in Nigeria, trying to counter violent extremism there, and the hate speech that often goes with some of the conflicts in that part of the world. And clearly the toughest things any of us have to do in that time is when you have to communicate that to her family. And then, of course, for us, we are determined to carry on with the best of her spirit and carry on with our work, because that's the best way to honor her life.
We certainly relate to that. We lost David Gilkey, our photographer, who is from Portland a few years ago. You also mentioned you're working in Syria, and I know Syria is contributing to perhaps what is one of the most pressing global issues, which is migration. We've got millions of displaced people across the globe, and sometimes they're in refugee camps for decades. How do you help those people?
Well, Syria, has been now 9 years on. There are 12 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 6 million people internally displaced by that conflict within Syria, 5 million people who fled the borders, most of whom live in the surrounding countries, and then we know a little bit over 1 million who made their way to Europe, which often gets more attention than the 4 million who are living in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. So for Mercy Corps, one, we work with those inside Syria, the 6 million, and bringing food assistance, bringing shelter, providing basic tools and materials that they need to survive. In Lebanon, in addition to that, we're doing schools, particularly working with adolescents. I had a chance earlier to meet with a wonderful group of young scholars from Clackamas and from various high schools here in Portland. Fantastic. We talked about how important it is to target and work with adolescents. And then we are also working where we can to give people the skills they'll need to recover. So we have an employment program in Lebanon and in Jordan that targets refugees as well as people in host communities that engage them. One of the things that you have to be careful about is providing a level of assistance to a refugee or to a displaced person that's greater than the community that's hosting them. You want to be sensitive to both groups, which we think is critical to do. And then, of course, long term, and we're already beginning to do work in Syria now where we're working with farmers so Syrians all over the country can begin to grow their own food again. We're repairing a lot of the social infrastructure, water, schools, at a community level, not massive systems, not working with government, but where you can work with local communities just to bring a little bit of normalcy back to life. That's what we're focused on.
Well, with migration, we're seeing some similar images on our southern border, as you see hundreds of thousands of Central Americans who are walking to try to get to the US. Do you see parallels between those situations?
Oh, I do. I see very strong parallels. And the first parallel is that, you know, it is rare that you would meet someone who left on their own accord. It's usually because they're fleeing violence, whether it's war in Syria, whether it's gang violence in Guatemala, whether it's a failed state in Venezuela. You know, that's what you experience in those situations. You know, I was just a couple of months ago, I was along the border of Venezuela inside Colombia, and I had a chance to talk with a number of the families there that had fled, and all of them wanted to go home. All of them wanted to get back, and they couldn't. They simply couldn't. You know, the markets were not functioning in Venezuela. You couldn't get basic medicines and supplies in Venezuela. So that situation is going to continue until we can see some kind of a resolution inside the country. And of course, that's why, as you alluded to earlier, Jane, that now the average time of displacement for most refugees is now over 20 years. That went, particularly when it's caused by forced migration because of a conflict.
And the people I have talked to in dire situations also, I often find they really don't want to leave. So I know you're working particularly in, I know one program in Guatemala, which
Yes.
actually is trying to help prevent the migration in the first place. Can you talk a little bit more about that program?
This is Convivamos, and it's a program that we do in Guatemala, working to try to counter gangs. And part of the way you do that is to keep kids in school longer, and then work with local community leaders to try to make it safer in those communities. And then we throw in an element of service for young people so that they not only stay in school longer, but they're actually involved in improving the quality of life in their neighborhood. Sometimes it's simple cleanup campaigns, sometimes it's tutoring younger members of the community. But what we have found in Guatemala, and frankly around the world, is that when you can keep young people, particularly in high school, keep them in school longer and combine an element of service to that, that does so much to promote their own self-esteem and to prevent them from choosing negative pathways, be it joining a gang or joining a terrorist group.
So cutting off, if we reduce our aid to places like Venezuela, is that going to just make our refugee issue worse?
You know, my team counseled me against being too political. And yet, in this case, some of you may have read an article that Tom Friedman wrote about it. He said, you can't fix stupid. And if your desire is to prevent migration and to slow down the reasons that drive a lot of the migration, the last thing you would do would be to cut off aid to those countries in Central America, particularly, you know, the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And we have concrete evidence that our programs that are working with gang kids, our programs that are working with farmers in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, they are preventing, or they're enabling people to stay in their home countries who otherwise would flee for the northern border. So I really can't understand any rationale for that. If there was real evidence that those programs didn't work or that they were contributing to corruption or bad governance, then we would understand it. But they're not. And there are numerous studies after numerous studies that demonstrate the impact of these programs.
I've noticed you have a lot of programs that focus on youth. Why is that? And do you need new strategies to try and engage that generation?
Yes, thank you for that question. I mean, probably the first reason that we focus on youth is where we work. And it's a very young world in the places that we work, in Africa, the Middle East, and other places. You know, the average age in Africa is 18, right? 18. 65% of the populations in Africa are under the age of 15. And so it's a very young continent. Of course, it goes along that Africa has to create 18 million jobs a year for the next 10 years to meet the demands of the younger population. So for us, we target youth, one, because they're the leaders of tomorrow, two, because they're at a period in life where they're making choices about whether they thrive or dive. And then three, we have developed, I love these programs as well, they're some of my favorite in the Mercy Corps world, is that we've developed partnerships with some of the technology companies, Google in particular, but Cisco and others, in leveraging the technology world that creates jobs for young people. And so we have an impact lab in Kenya, we have an impact lab in Jordan, and we have an accelerator, and I'll tell you what this is in a minute, in Gaza, all aimed at young people that's building their skills, particularly around coding and technology skills. It's providing an opportunity for some to launch their own businesses. They go through competitions. We've connected them with venture funding. This has created thousands and thousands of jobs. And third, they are freelancing hubs, because so many of the jobs of the future are going to be linked, particularly in Africa, are going to be linked to technology and to the gig economy. So that's an area that Mercy Corps has carved out as a specialty that we love to focus on. Of course, we couldn't do it without some of the incredible partnerships we have with leading technology companies.
I want to move now to the other big issue you mentioned, which was climate change, and certainly we've documented that climate change is contributing to migration, conflict,
yes,
poverty, all the big issues that you mentioned. So how does that impact your work?
Well, it impacts it both immediately in very concrete ways, which I'll describe, and then I think we all know how it's going to impact our planet long term. Immediately, I don't think it is unfair to say that the crisis we saw in Darfur, which originally started as herders were pushing further south in Sudan onto the lands of farmers. You know, there have been ancient rivalries between herders and farmers, as we know, for thousands of years. But now, as the climate changes the resources, as it reduces water, as it strains, particularly these pastoralists, they're pushing into lands traditionally where you had farmers. That's creating more conflict. That, and then terrible politics, led to a lot of the crisis in Darfur. As I mentioned earlier, Syria, 5 years prior to the conflict in Syria, Syria had its worst drought ever, over a 5-year period, its worst drought ever. That led to a dramatic increase in food prices. It significantly impacted agriculture, and it forced a significant rural to urban migration, which strained resources in the cities. Now, Syria may still have happened because of bad politics, but this accelerated it in significant ways. We see that now in Nigeria today. Same in the Middle Belt. Conflict is occurring around a competition for resources. We see this in the southern part of Ethiopia, where we work. So many of the conflicts that we deal with are aggravated by climate. Long term, again, no one knows for sure, right, what the exact impact is going to be. But we know enough to know that storms will be more severe, droughts will be more severe, and if we think we're dealing with migration challenges now, and we are, these are serious issues, then when climate kicks in fully, some of the estimates by scientists that by the year 2050, 200 to 250 million people could be impacted, causing the kind of migration that we could only imagine right now. So I think the stakes are serious. You know, obviously an organization like Mercy Corps can only do so much addressing it, and we do so much at the community level, but this is going to take a global effort around major policies that we all know if we are to stop the irreversible changes in our climate.
I think with water conflict, we can see that in California.
Yes.
We're probably going to have lots of Californians moving up here. One of the projects that you're doing around water resources is in Niger. But I'm going to take a little break before I ask you that question to just remind our radio audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Jane Greenhalgh, Senior Producer and Editor on NPR's Science Desk, and I'm here today with Neal Keny-Guyer, the CEO of Mercy Corps. So, Neal, you're partnering with NASA, which I thought was fascinating, to try and find new water sources. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's kind of galactic, don't you think? And this is a great partnership we're proud of, and I can tell you how it came about. In so many places where we work, take Niger, for example, farmers there depended on rain-fed agriculture for years and years. And with climate change, now those rains have become completely unpredictable. And so farmers are having to look for and identify groundwater. It's hard to identify. With our partnership with NASA, we're using their satellites and technology to identify where the pockets of groundwater are and how to sustainably harvest that groundwater. It's making it way more precise. And it's enabling us to do much better agriculture than we ever could before. And there will be other benefits to that partnership, but that's one of the reasons that we're so proud of that. It does give me, an opportunity, Jane, if you don't mind, just to say the partnerships with NASA, with some of the technology companies, I do think it is so important that we bring innovation, that we leverage technology, particularly in the social change space. And we take a lot of pride in doing that. Again, you take agriculture, the use of sensors now to do more precise agriculture around the world that conserves water, that is more sustainable, to be able to do agriculture that minimizes the use of carbon, that minimizes fertilizers and pesticides, in so many places that couldn't do that now. It's making us much better. We're increasing the incomes of farmers, and we're increasing productivity in a much more sustainable way. So I am a big fan of these partnerships, of innovation, and of the right use of technology.
I think the one thing that struck me was that you're not getting the data from NASA and giving it to the people in Niger. You're actually making connections between NASA and the people on the ground, which I think is important because I've been to several countries where organizations go in, they put in a water treatment plant, and then it breaks down and they've got a broken plant. So is that a priority of Mercy Corps to try and train the people on the ground to be able to do this on their own?
I think the priority is always, first and foremost, to respect the partners that you work with on the ground. Those impacted are always the best agents of their own change. I think that is a fundamental principle. So it starts with respect, starts with dignity, and then I think we all know change anywhere happens when local people, when local organizations feel the ownership and that they have the skills and the tools to be able to make those changes. Some of that is information, some of it is technical, and some of it is just their own political empowerment as well.
Well, speaking of locally, I have to say when I first went to visit the Mercy Corps headquarters in Old Town, it actually reminded me a little bit of some of the squalid areas I've been to, with people sleeping on the street, maybe defecating on the street. And I wonder if there are any lessons that you've learned helping globally that you can bring home.
Wow. That's not a simple question, and I'm tempted because I know there are some great groups here that work with the homeless, that are on the front lines. I know people like my wife Alyssa are trying to increase our housing supply, increase density, raise the resources so that we can provide the kind of wraparound and mental health services that are so critical in addressing this this challenge. And I think for us, if we have learned anything that is true both overseas and with our own work here at home, is that you have to work with local capacity and local organizations, those that are truly grassroots, that truly come from the community. That's the only thing that is sustainable. And clearly we do that wherever we work around the world, and we do that through Mercy Corps Northwest here. The other thing that I would say is that, and this is a principle of Mercy Corps, is that none of the big challenges that we face can ever be solved by a single organization or a single sector. I think this is true everywhere. And it's why almost everywhere we will try, where you can, sometimes it's harder, but is to be a catalyst that brings together the public sector, the private sector, business, and community organizations. To me, that's the golden triangle. And any big change never happens, is never sustained if you don't bring together government, business, and civil society. And that's as true here in Portland as it is anywhere in the world.
So if you are working in a place like the DNC, I think you said, or Congo?
DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo.
Democratic Republic of Congo, which is an area actually that we're looking at because they're having an Ebola outbreak there. If you have a country that you need to go into where the government is not functioning, or perhaps the government is part of the problem, how do you deal with that?
Another easy question. So the first is, we have a bias for dealing with government wherever we can, even when government is not completely our cup of tea. And we often find that even when government doesn't work at a national level, there are always local officials at local government, at regional government that you can work with, and it's important to do so. And usually you'll find people of goodwill who are members of that community, and so we will try to build relationships. In the DRC right now, we're having to work very closely with the public health authorities. It's critical. We won't tackle Ebola there if we can't do it with the government of the DRC. And it's alarming. Just this month, there have been more Ebola cases than in the 2 previous worst months before. So it's on the rise. There was a health worker killed, an international health worker killed there last week because people on the ground don't understand what Ebola means, are fearful, they're distrustful of government, they're even distrustful of the international community. And so we have to work to turn that around. We have to find partners with government. I was telling the group of scholars earlier, our wonderful high school kids who are here, that sometimes we find it easier to deal with some of the more distasteful groups. We've sometimes had a better track record negotiating with the Taliban, or sometimes worse groups where we have to deliver aid, than with some of the government. I better not name names because you never know if they're listening, but we all know that kind of authoritative dictatorships are on the rise, and that makes it very difficult. But we never give up. We always try to build those relationships, because without them, it's very hard to get anything done.
I mentioned to a colleague of mine who covered the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, which was a huge outbreak, that I was going to be interviewing you, and she said, oh, Mercy Corps, they were there, and the fact that they already had their transportation system in place, it meant that they were able to act in a way that other groups that were just coming in to try and set up couldn't. Is that very important for you to have a presence, an ongoing presence in some of these countries?
I think it's very important, and when we have that present, I think that's our value add, because we understand the situation and the dynamics. We know the local culture, we know the local politics, and we have relationships that you can leverage on behalf of a better response. I mean, during the Ebola crisis, one of the greatest contributions that we made, in part because we were doing agriculture work, is initially the instinct of the international community, of the government, was to shut down everything. That created hunger. You couldn't move food from the fields to the market. And then the idea was to bring in a bunch of food from the outside of the World Health Organization. Well, because we had all those relationships, we did a quick study showing that, one, it's going to be a lot cheaper if you use food that's grown in Liberia. Two, there are ways to do it that don't spread, Ebola. And three, that's a much better, because it keeps communities healthy, because farmers get paid. And so we were able to reverse the whole policy of bringing in massive amount of food from the outside and relying on local resources, which in subsequent studies demonstrate was a big part of getting on top of Ebola sooner rather than later. And we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't have had that knowledge on the ground and leveraged the work we'd been doing there for years.
And did that help with the interpersonal relationships? Because I know in Ebola there was a great deal of both fear and also mistrust. The relief workers were wanting to bury the bodies
That's right.
quickly. The families wanted to take the bodies home. How did you navigate that?
Yes, I mean, I think it did. It enabled us to do real focus groups with the communities, and then we did a social media campaign and a radio show that was able to get information out to people at scale. We're talking about millions in order to change behavior. And I think, again, because one, we had the trust, two, we were able to do focus groups with Liberians. In this case, I will say, Liberia had a very talented leader in Helen Sirleaf Johnson, and she was very committed. We happened to have a strong relationship with her and with the team around her as well, and that gave us more influence than we otherwise would have had.
Considering you're leading such a big organization and you're in so many places, how do you maintain the integrity of your organization? We have seen stories of poor people are very vulnerable. We've seen stories of sexual harassment with aid workers, and also the amounts of money that are being raised. How do you ensure that the money goes to the people that need the help?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jane. So the first thing I would say, in the bigger picture, and those of you here or in the audience who run organizations, I think will agree, the first thing you've got to get right is culture, your organizational culture. And we work really hard on inculcating a culture throughout the organization that stresses transparency, that stresses ethical behavior, that builds on values, and attracts the kind of people who hopefully would never engage in this kind of behavior and would speak up quickly if they saw it. So it starts with culture, and that's something we invest in throughout the organization. It's really critical. In fact, if anyone's interested, go look at our culture on our website. I think you'll find it very interesting. We have 8 principles that we build the culture around that we're very proud of. If there's magic sauce in Mercy Corps, it's all related to our culture. But then secondly, you can't just rely on that. And so we have very explicit training on sexual harassment, on what's feasible, what's not acceptable. We do it throughout the organization, not just with people in our headquarters, but with team members on the front lines, with with our national team members. Everywhere goes through this kind of training, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times in their first 3 years of being with us. And then, of course, we have hotlines and the ability to investigate whenever complaints come in. We react very, very quickly. And then in terms of stewardship, for us, if we can't maintain the trust with our donor partners, we can't operate. And so having the systems in place, the financial mechanisms, as well as the ability to get on top of quickly wherever we hear of any signs of corruption. Look, you're not going to work in the places where we work and not occasionally have some challenges. That would be nice. If any organization tells you they have never seen corruption in their work, Don't believe it. And when you work in places where we work, you know, there's going to be attempts at that even more. You know, when, knock on wood, we see it. We've never had it get significantly out of control. And again, I think it's because of our culture and because of the systems that we have in place in order to mitigate against that.
I think the country that springs to mind on this question is Haiti, because I remember going over for the earthquake and so much money was raised. Everyone was really committed to helping, and then 2 years later, I was going back because there was a cholera outbreak, because the UN peacekeeping forces had inadvertently introduced the cholera bacteria to the island. So when you're faced with a country like Haiti that needs some basic infrastructure, like a sewer system, how do you partner with a government like Haiti in order to perhaps just put in a sewer system?
Yeah, I mean, again, no easy answer to that. I wish there were. What I will say is that, you know, we're always trying to look for systemic change, not just one-off change. We know if you give us enough money, we can go into any community and make a change. The question is, can you sustain it? And then can you scale that change at a level that makes a difference for a population? And that's our value add for an organization of our size and capacity. That's where we should be focused on. So, you know, we will try to do it. We'll often, though, start at local level with government. And so I'll give you an example. We are implementing a program now. It's probably our largest water resource program in the world, where we are building a new water system for Goma and Bukavu in the DRC, one of the toughest places. It will reach, when we are finished, it will provide clean, affordable water to 2 million people. We negotiated for years to be able to set up a public-private entity that will manage this. Previously, it was managed solely by the government. Over years, and working with our donor partner, in this case the British government, we were able to convince the government to put in place, you know, we take this for granted, a public-private entity that will manage the water authority, that will have accountability to citizens within it. So we feel like we've built transparency into a new form of governance at a scale that will make a huge difference. And so we're really, really proud of that. But in addition to that, you know, the previous way people have been getting water is either through private contractors charging exorbitant amounts that most people couldn't afford, or being trucked in by the humanitarian community at cost 15 and 20 times what will be provided now. And you know, this could have, the sad thing is, this could have been done 15 and 20 years ago had we thought about building up local infrastructure first, coming with a development mentality, and not just with an emergency relief mentality. So it's a great question, and I think our community's getting smarter about it. And in this case, you know, I think Mercy Corps is one of the organizations that's helping to lead the way.
I think that's great. I have to say, when I was in Haiti in 2015, I was there to witness the opening of the first sewage treatment plant for Port-au-Prince, which is a city the size of Chicago. It was like 2015, and they're just getting a water treatment plant. Well, for our radio audience, I have to remind people that this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Jane Greenhalgh, Senior Producer and Editor on NPR's Science Desk, and I'm here today with Neal Keny-Guyer, the CEO of Mercy Corps. And I think it's time now to go to the audience for some questions. So if we could get the first question, please, from the microphone.
Excuse my cold. Okay. So my question is, in instances where communities do not want your organization present, how do you go about continuing to help them and continue with your work?
Sorry, can you repeat that again, please?
In instances where communities do not want your organization present, how do you go about continuing your work and help?
Great. That's a great question. I knew I was going to get a hard question because I met with the students beforehand. I said, "Are you sure they have to go first?" No, thank you. That's a great question. Again, no simple answer to that. What I will say is that we work really hard and pride ourselves on building those local relationships. I think it starts first of all with the recognition of going in with a little humility and recognizing that most of the solution and answers are probably already lying there somewhere with the community, and you can just help bring them about and help facilitate, catalyze that solution. And when you do that, you build dignity, you build trust, and you build partnership, which is absolutely critical. I will say that even in these really dangerous and difficult places, Mercy Corps prides itself on being able to operate. We operate all over the southern part of Afghanistan now, which is where the Taliban operates. Very few organizations can do it. We've somehow managed to build a relationship of trust with local communities and with the commanders of the Taliban in order to keep up work, including educating girls. Even when people say that's not possible to do, you know, we've said it is, if you take the time to build relationships with that. So that's a great question, and you know, it only starts with respect and trust and with dignity and a spirit of partnership.
Next question, please.
Bill Dickey, City Club member. One quick one for the audience. It's our spring membership drive at City Club. If you were to join City Club today, me and my company will match your membership with a donation to Mercy Corps.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
So join City Club today. What you are already told to by our illustrious speaker today. My question is more nuts and bolts about Mercy Corps. It seems so huge when I'm sitting here listening to you, and you know, you think of it as down in the building and by the Skidmore Fountain, and I'd like to just know, you know, employee count, where do you get, who's your biggest funders, just some nuts and bolts about Mercy Corps in, you know, 30 seconds or less.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and thank you for that kind. More important, well, look, we appreciate everybody's support, but seriously, join City Club. We need engaged citizens, and this is a great way to do it. So Mercy Corps, we're almost 40 years old. We started during the killing fields of Cambodia, was the impetus for the founding of the organization. We are now about $500 million on an annual basis as an organization. We work in 43 countries around the world. We have 5,600 people on a payroll. The vast majority of those are from the countries where we work. One little known fact is of our international team who work overseas, people often think of it, it's primarily Americans or Westerners. 67% are non-Western in our senior positions who are international team members who are overseas. We are, because of where we work, because we've chosen to work in the really fragile places of the world, about 80%, so roughly 400 million of our 500 million comes from governments, with the U.S. government being about half of that, and then we get money from the British government, Europeans, and interesting, other governments around the world. We got our first grant recently indirectly from China. I think we were one of the first INGOs to do so. But we still raise a significant, about 100 million from around the world from private sources, small donors, large donors, companies, and foundations, from every legal source. And then I sometimes joke and say, I don't want to know about the non-legal, so no, I'm just kidding on that. So I appreciate the question, and that's the thumbnail sketch of Mercy Corps.
We have another question from one of our civics scholars. Can you say your name and which high school you're from, too?
I'm Brianna Gibson. I go to Clackamas High School. I'm a junior. I'd like to ask about, with our resources becoming less abundant, do you notice that large companies you're like negotiating more with them, and do they play more of a role in like helping you or harming your cause?
Oh, Brianna, good question. For us, I will say that we have looked to partner with the private sector around their mission less as a philanthropic partner. And the reason we do that, we find that we get the best of the company, and hopefully they get the best of us, and the impact is greater. Let me give you a quick example of that. So we have a major partnership with Cisco around technology. Cisco has given us about $10 million to hire a world-class technology team in order to work on things like data security and protection, in order to work on identity. And we have pledged that as we demonstrate how to do this with some of their technology, but not always their technology, we will share that with the whole community, right? We work with Google very much on how do you leverage digital platforms to employ young people. They're obviously interested in that for a number of reasons, but when we're working at that level, rather than just seeing a company as a philanthropic partner, we find that the relationship is healthier and we get more impact. And I could name a number of examples around that. And so for us, it's been really important to have those relationships with the private sector, and we're very grateful for them.
I just got handed a question that I should have asked, which is, you've got a lot to celebrate, but could you share a case where the program was not successful?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that for me, the biggest thing that I think about all the time is how do we move needles, not just implement projects well. I know we've reached a level where, we can do an agriculture project, we can do a water project, and we can do it well, but how often does it add up in a place like Yemen or Syria to begin to move a needle toward real stability and peace? And so and in so many of those tough places, I don't feel like we're making the kind of impact that is needed around addressing the root causes of the conflict. We're trying. We're one of the few organizations that has a team that's trying to address the root causes. But they're challenging. And I know that we can't do it alone. And so I wish that our ability to influence other governments who maybe have more influence was stronger. Again, we are working on that. I think we do as much as anyone in that space. But given the scale of the challenges, the severity of the rise, particularly in conflict and of fragile states that we see around the world, I think it's an incumbent on all of us to lift our game for more impact in today's world.
Okay, let's try another question.
Win Wakala, City Club member and also Executive Director for FAST, which stands for Fight Against Sex Trafficking and Fight Against Slavery/Trafficking. How often do you see trafficking in your work, and what do you do about it?
Good. Well, first of all, thank you for your work and the work that you do. So for Mercy Corps, that has not been a core issue that we have taken on as an organization, though we will always support. When we see it, it's just like with human rights. When we see trafficking or we encounter rings and feel like we have insights into that others, one, will go to the local groups or the international groups that are working on the issue and make them aware, and we'll do what we can to support it. And obviously we work in areas, because it's often in in these fragile countries with poor governance that are often the sources of a lot of the trafficking that we see. Secondly, I would say we do a lot of work in upholding the rights of women, in promoting gender equality. So in a larger sense, we're working on the kind of cultural issues that sometimes give rise to that. And then, thank you. And then finally, what I would say in that regard, and we've probably done it more directly with human rights groups, because we're an operational group on the ground, we can't speak up around human rights in our name, because one, we would risk being kicked out, or worse, we would risk having a number of our team members hurt on the ground. I think everyone can appreciate that. But we will work very closely with Human Rights Watch, with Amnesty, and share with them what we are witnessing on the ground. Back during the height of the Syrian conflict, when you were reading about barrel bombing and a violation of we were providing many of those reports, and they were being issued. We were providing it encrypted, and Human Rights Watch would issue the report. So we do feel a strong responsibility to bear witness to what we see on the ground, particularly gross violations of human rights, none more gross than the trafficking of kids.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so one or hopefully two more questions.
Hi, Neil. My name is Nevra. I was born and raised in Istanbul, and 4 years ago, my company moved me here to Portland, and as you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, I am so grateful to be a part of this amazing community. I want to thank you, your wife, and the team you build up. My heart is beating up for your calling and your mission. I think you're achieving and making the impact that the governments cannot do. For that matter, every year all my gifts are presented to my friends in the form of a Mercy Corps donation, and it will continue to be that way. As you know, Turkey received or welcomed more than 2 million Syrians, and every year I go back home, which is Istanbul, my heart is crying to see those 2 to 3-year-old Syrian babies begging on the streets or sneaking into public transportations. I'm afraid they're gonna die, into buses to sell tissues. That's why with your calling, with your mission, I'm trying to help those fragile, fragmented countries. With your team, I'm trying to help and support them as much as I can. And my question is, what is your call to action to us to grow, to support you more, to donate you, or in the form of donations or in the form of volunteer work? What can we do more? Because I truly believe your calling and the things you do is beyond governments.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you for what you do and for the passion that you bring. Thank you. It's a great question, and you know, honestly, I'm obviously proud of the work of Mercy Corps, but you know, we're part of an incredible community, and so when someone asks me, I always say, look, because I think globally, but I know it's so important that we make a difference in our own backyards as well. So I tell everyone, you know, pick at least one local organization that you can get involved in, give to, get on the board, support financially with your skills, with however you can, and get engaged, and pick at least one international organization, because I do think there is a seamless web of compassion that connects a homeless child in Portland with a hurting child somewhere else around the world. And when we all embrace that, when we see that as a community, we have a much better chance to build a stronger Portland and a much better chance to build a better world. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that beautiful call to action, our time is up and we will have to pause the conversation for now. We are grateful to everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you, Oriana Manera, for producing, Oric Public Finance for sponsoring, the Civic Scholars from North Clackamas for coming downtown to join us, and Neal Keny-Guyer and Jane Greenhalgh for this fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.